Thank you, Ya. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna share my screen. So my focus for today is on political trust in China. So the topic is that Chinese trust in government is high and stable. So when we think about the Western democracy, trust has been low now than ever, right? So in the United States, for example, trust has been declining for like since 1958 when the American National Election Study began measuring trust in government. So if you ask whether, for example, American, whether they will have confidence in the national government, only 10% would say they have confidence in their national federal level government. But if you ask Chinese, recent data shows more than 90% of Chinese would say they have a good deal of trust in the national government, right? And then the pattern of high trust among Chinese has been stable for decades, several decades. So one of the earliest survey that report that Chinese have very high level of trust is in 1993, the survey, political scientist Tian Jianshi, the survey, a nationally represented survey, report that over 70% say they say that they can trust the decision made by central government. So this is probably one of the earliest survey that document high trust in Chinese government. And over the years, national surveys, international surveys consistently show that Chinese people have very high level of trust in the government. So for example, this is 2001 survey and this 2008 China survey. And then the world value survey also include measures of people's confidence and trust in the government. And this is the visualization over the years. You can see more than 20 years ago, over 90% Chinese say they trust the government. Quite a lot, a great deal, right? In 2007, the same pattern. 2013, the same pattern. 2018, the same pattern, right? So the high trust has been stable for quite a long time. And then during the pandemic, I published an opinion piece showing that during the pandemic, using the survey data that weeks after the pandemic, we surveyed almost 20,000 Chinese online. And then what we have shown is that Chinese trust in government has increased during the pandemic. More than 95% say they have trust in the government, right? So the article is published in the Washington Post. But the comments you see here, so there's the Washington Post allows comments from the public, right? So the several comments are captured. So one, for example, the first one is that if I live in a country where all my conversations can be monitored and my family and I could be taken out for tea, right, for conversation, then my responses will be pretty positive, regardless of my real feelings, right? So the assumption is that the high trust Chinese people express is out of political fear, right? And then second one is that I cannot imagine why anyone in a repressive authoritarian regime would answer a poster honestly, right? But there's also some other ways that some people said, as a resident of China, the results are completely unsurprising, right? So there's different voice thinking about people's trust in China, in their government. So in general, there's a widespread assumption is that authoritarian regime political system cannot be legitimate, right? So underlying in terms of political trust is Chinese should have lower trust in government relatively, for example, relative to democracies, right? Because China is considered to be an authoritarian regime, undemocratic, right? And second is that Chinese, the expressed trust from survey data, from other empirical work is fake, is not true, right? So the two kind of like more like public beliefs about high trust in China documented by empirical data and research. And then in real academic research, there's three approaches to political trust in China. So one is simply, oh, China high trust is an outlier. So especially in comparative work, so China is often excluded because it's outlier, shouldn't have high trust. Right? So that's the first approach. Dismiss China case or the China in comparative politics research, for example. And then the second approach is that high trust in China is too good to be true, right? So this line of research is trying to understand the limitation or the bias from the data. For example, the survey data or the field work or like experimental research data. They're trying to find a way to think high trust is too good to be true, and then maybe data problem, right? Survey data problem, the data bias. And a third approach is trying to understand, okay, maybe high trust could be true. So what's the meaning of high trust, right? Is people expressed for example, the same type of trust in relative or compared to people in the United States or in Canada, in Western democracies, right? So it could be different type of trust. And then there's also people thinking about maybe the formation of trust could be different in China than other places, right? In general, in political trust research about China, they're taking three kind of approaches. So today, I'm here to talk about the response pattern approach. Thinking about the key argument is that how people trying to figure out whether high trust is real or fake. And the key argument I have is that how people express their attitudes provides a means to test whether the expressed attitudes can be fake or ingenuine or genuine, right? So the idea is that not just focusing on how much people trust, the level of trust, but also how the pattern of trust, right? So for example, when we say something, how we say something define the meaning of what we say, right? So that's kind of like the pattern of how people express their attitudes, including trust, could help define the meaning of, for example, the level of trust. So that's in general the key argument, a response pattern approach, looking for the pattern, trying to figure out the meaning of the level of political trust in China. So the data I'm gonna rely on just multiple sources, or survey data. So first, the Asian Barometer survey is like this cross-sectional data, but over time for China, and World Value Survey, and also national survey, Chinese Family Panel Study. I'm gonna use data from this three surveys, two are cross-sectional, and then Chinese Family Panel Studies. Panel study is longitudinal data. And then I want to briefly talk about the measures of trust in government, right? So Asian Barometer survey and the World Value survey, they use simple measure, like do you trust in, for example, a list of political institutions, national government, court, police, or local government, right? And then for World Value survey is similar, but they use confidence. Do you have confidence in national government, right? So it's just a little bit different, but in general, the question format are very similar. And then Chinese Family Panel Study only include one items about political trust, is how much trust do you have in local, kind of like more like local ganbu, political officials. So those are the measures of trust in government. So now, I'm gonna report 10 patterns from the data. So first pattern is that DCK responses. So the idea is that those surveys include that you can express your trust, but you can also choose to to indicate that you don't understand the question or cannot choose or decline to answer, right? The idea is that if political fear is high, that your people, Chinese, have concern about expressing their views or distrust. So then they can choose to, for example, answer or indicate that response using decline to answer or cannot choose, right? And then so the idea that if political fear is in play, we would expect that high percentage people would go for this options, right? DCK responses, right? And then there's some research already report that, for example, one recent research showing that, yes, in China, there's high percentage, about 9 or 8% of Chinese, when they answer the survey, they would go for those DCK response. And then they separate between, re-estimate the level of trust between people, like when those answers drop and when those answers included, right? And then this is a nice table reporting the level of trust between and after excluding, dropping the DCK response. But one pattern we can see is that even those answers dropped or included, so you don't see much gap in terms of level of trust. Chinese, you see, still have a very, very high level of trust in, for example, villager leaders, central leaders, provincial leaders, right, or the government, right? So you see that even excluding those responses, we don't see much in terms of the level of trust. But another thing I want to add is that whether China has a high percentage of DCK responses, right? So in this article, authors just focus on China, right? But here I look at cross-Asian society, thinking about whether China really has a high percentage of people who respond DCK, choose DCK categories, right? But the data shows that not the case, right? In China, about 9% Chinese survey respondents choose DCK responses, and it's relatively similar to Japan, similar to other countries, right? So this shows maybe DCK answers are not high. So China does not really have high DCK answers, right? So this is the first pattern. Maybe it's not about political fear, right? Second pattern is about interview privacy. So the idea that in the one value survey, Asian Barometer survey, and then also CFPS, they have questions captured whether the interview, the level of privacy during the interview, right? So for example, for Asian Barometer survey and World Value survey, there's question asking whether there are others around during the interview who can follow the interview, right? So the idea is if there are people around, people are more likely to express their fake trust, fake attitudes, right? Because if political fear is in play, right? When there are people around, then you should be more careful, right? Not saying that you don't trust the government, right? So the idea is that when there's no privacy, people can express, maybe more likely to express a real attitude. But when there's no privacy, they should hide their true feelings, right? When there's privacy, they could be more likely to express their true feeling, political trust. So using the data from World Value Survey, this is what the pattern, right? So even when there are people around, Chinese still express, even when there's no people around, Chinese still express high level of trust, right? So for example, the first panel in this figure, first panel shows that comparing the people around, or there were no others around, there's no much differences in terms of level of trust, right? So the gap is similar to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other Chinese societies. And then United States, Japan, South Korea, similar patterns, but maybe in some other countries, for example, those countries maybe have Ukraine, for example, maybe there's some political fear. Then when there's others around, then political trust is higher, right? Maybe that suggests, but we don't see the pattern in China. And then using the Asian Barometer survey, similar, we don't see the pattern that when there's people around, Chinese have higher trust. And then the CFPS showed similar pattern. When the interview being recorded, we do not see that trust is higher, right? So this is the second pattern and a third pattern is I got no better, right? So the idea is that people who have more political knowledge, right? Or people at higher status, more knowledge, follow news more often. They understand the political dynamics a little bit more. They understand the repercussions from the state or political censorship a little bit more, or they have more to lose when people at higher status. So those populations should have higher trust if political fear is in play, right? So, but the pattern shows it's not the case, right? So in terms of education, for example, across educational categories, people express high trust. And then even higher educated people tend to have a little lower trust, right? So education tend to have a negative impact in trust. The pattern is inconsistent with like everywhere, right? For example, in the United States, highly educated people tend to be more critical, tend to have lower trust, right? In China, we see the same pattern. And the urban-rural, we do not see much differences in terms of urban-rural. If there's differences, then urban people tend to have lower trust. But if political fear is in play, we should expect that urban people are more afraid of expressing their true, for example, distrust. They should tend to hold higher trust, right? Try to fake themselves. But the pattern shows the opposite, that rural people tend to have more trust than urban Chinese. And internet use, people who follow more often or use the internet more often tend to have lower trust, right? But if political fear is in play, we should expect that people who are using internet more often, they have better understanding about political censorship, about political dynamic, political environment in China. They should fake themselves more often, right? So, but we do not see the pattern. Pattern 4, interview observations, right? So they, in the survey, they include some interviewer observations. So for example, this is the word value survey, I think. So how sincere was the respondent, including Asian Barometer survey, also include this question. How sincere was the respondent when answering sensitive questions, right? So 3 categories: highly sincerely, fairly sincere, and not sincere, not very sincere at all, right? So those are interviewer observation, right? So the idea is if high trust is not real, then we would expect that more sincere respondents should show lower trust, right? Because based on the interviewer observation, if they're expressing sincere attitude and the trust should be lower in China, then we should see lower trust among people who are more sincerely. And then you may ask, who are the interviewers, right? So this is a picture from the directors of Asian Barometer survey. They show that how they recruited interviewers. Most interviewers are trained university students, and this is a contact, like locations where they reach out to Chinese to interview Chinese, right? So not public officials go around the villages trying to interview people, as university students, right? So then based on their observation, we may be able to trust that the observation should be true, right? So when we look at those level of sincere responses, we do not see a pattern that indicate political fear, right? So when people are highly sincerely, we should, among those people, have very high level of trust, right? But in general, across the interviewer observation categories, trust is high across those categories. So this pattern also indicate political trust in China might not be a result of political fear. And then pattern 5, number 5, real sensitive question, right? So when we think about trust in government, it's not really that sensitive, right? So what do you trust in government, right? Is this a sensitive question or not, right? But in the survey, they ask more sensitive questions. For example, in Asian Barometer survey, they have questions. How often do you think government leaders break the law or abuse the power, right? And then there's also questions asking, do officials who commit crimes go unpunished? I think those kind of questions might be more sensitive than just asking, do you trust in the government, right? So the idea is if political fear is in play, few would agree to those statements, right? They will try to hide, not criticize the government in terms of whether they commit crime or go unpunished, right? But for those more sensitive questions, we see, for example, the first always, most of time is very high. And even sometimes you see more than 20, almost 30% Chinese will say officials, most of time, always commit crimes, go unpunished, right? And similarly, almost 30% of Chinese say think that government leaders often break the law and abuse their power, right? So they're not really afraid of expressing those views, right? So, but trust, do you trust in the government? Maybe not as sensitive as those kind of questions. Pattern number 6, more fear, more trust, right? So think about if political trust or trust in government is a result of production of political fear, then we would expect that people who have higher political fear, they should express more trust, fake trust, right? So in Asian Barometer survey, they have a question asking the people's perception about whether people in China can free to speak with what they think without fear, right? So this is a question included in the Asian Barometer survey over time. So here is the distribution, right? People are free to speak what they think without fear. 10% strongly agrees, and then think about this, 20% somewhat disagree, and then there's people strongly disagree, right? So the idea is we would expect people who somewhat disagree or strongly disagree, and then somewhat strongly agree. The level of trust should be different across the fear, the perceived political fear, right? But the pattern is also not showing, right? Across those levels of political fear, Chinese still have very high level of trust in the government, right? Almost 90% across those, no matter whether they fear or they perceive more fear or less fear. Pattern number 7, mainlanders in Hong Kong, right? So one value survey in 2014, before the Hong Kong protest in 2019, right? So this relatively Hong Kong is a little different Chinese society in terms of political environment. So the survey including a question about the interview language, right? So this Cantonese and the Chinese in terms Mandarin, right? So the idea is that those Hong Kong people who speak Chinese, Mandarin in Hong Kong, they are more likely to be mainland immigrants in Hong Kong, right? So that they're not born, and I double check, those people are more likely to be the who were born outside Hong Kong. So they speak Chinese, so they're not speaking the local Cantonese language. So the expectation is that if Chinese have low trust in government, so when if their high trust is fake, then when they are in Hong Kong, well, maybe there's less political fear, or they're more free to speak without fear. They should express lower trust, or similar to what, for example, what Hong Kong people would say, the level of trust, right? But the pattern shows that, you see, the first the bar is Cantonese, likely to be Hong Kong local native populations. And the second, who speak Chinese during the interview, is more likely to be mainlanders in Hong Kong. You see, mainlanders in Hong Kong have much, much higher trust than local Hong Kong residents, native populations, right? So even in the same political environment, in 2014, probably there's more freedom relatively, right? So we still see high trust among mainland Chinese in Hong Kong. So pattern number 8, when we think about political values, right? So when we think about political knowledge, thinking about children and adults, right? So if high trust, political trust is fake, we would expect that maybe there's a pattern, different pattern for a child and an adult, right? Because children, they probably have little knowledge about political censorship, right? And then adults, they have more knowledge, understanding about the political environment. They should, right, express higher fake trust if trust is fake, right? So Chinese family panel study, they have interviewed children aged 10 to 15, those Chinese children, right? And the self-report from those adolescent children, right? So idea is that maybe what the children's indicate in survey, maybe it's more trustworthy, more genuine, more authentic, right? So I'm comparing, but when I compare the political trust level between children and adults, I see trust is higher among young children, right? So this also indicate maybe it's political trust is not about political fear, right? Even among children, political trust is high, relatively higher than adult. Pattern number 9, I call it a paradox of distance, right? The idea is that if political censorship or political fear in play, that we would expect, for example, trust in national government in Beijing, then we would expect to see the people who came from Beijing would express more fake high trust, right? If political fear is in play. So that's one. And the other is about the level of political institutions, right? In China, it's very hierarchical, but national government, local government, right? So if political censorship, political fear is in play, we would expect local residents, ordinary Chinese, should fake their trust more in local officials, right? Because that's where the political contact happens, right? So if people are afraid of expressing their views, they should be afraid of expressing their views toward the local officials, right? Because local officials are close to, for example, their lives, and so the idea is that we would expect, for example, Chinese should have more trust in local government, but less trust in like national government that is far away, right? But the pattern is that in Beijing people have lower trust in the government, right? So this is probably because of, for example, Beijing people are more educated and more exposure to internet and everything. So, and then I showed early on that highly educated, urban, and then people who follow news more often, internet news more often, tend to have lower trust, right? So Beijing, as we expect, Beijing residents tend to have lower trust than the rest of the country. And then another pattern is the local and the national. So we see there's a very unique pattern in China. So everywhere in the world that people, for example, in the United States, in Canada, in many European countries, that people tend to have much, much more trust in local, lower level government than in federal, higher level, right? But only China is the only place that shows people have much, much, much more trust in national level government than the local government, right? But still, in local government, Chinese people still have very high. So relatively, for example, local government, this is 2018 data, 68% of people say they trust the local government, right? So still, but you see the hierarchical trust, there's a paradox of distance that is. Finally, pattern number 10 is, I got latent patterns, right? So the idea is that for this one, I don't have rationale, right? So it's just like using modeling techniques, say latent class analysis. The idea is that using the pattern of response, the latent class analysis, try to group the response into clusters, right? And then how many clusters depends on the modeling, right? So based on my analysis, the latent class analysis identify 3 clusters, right? So class 1 only accounting for 5% of Chinese, class 2, 57%, and class 3, 38%. And then when we look at the level of trust, the 5% class 1, only 5% of Chinese have low trust in political institutions across the political institutions, right? So 57 and 38%, they all have lower. So probably those are low trust, 3 classes, low trust, medium trust, and then high trust, right? 38% have very high level of trust in all political institutions. And then 57% of Chinese have moderate, right? So trust is measured from 1 to 4, from not at all to quite a great deal and quite a lot in number 3. So you see that even the medium level of trust, most 57% of Chinese have quite a lot and above trust in all those political institutions, right? So to conclude, so I showed 10 patterns, and the only thing I'm trying to suggest is that those patterns could reflect or suggest that high trust in Chinese, high trust in government could be real and meaningful, right? So for future research, we cannot just, okay, this Chinese high trust is fake, right? It's an outlier. Instead, we really need to think about what's the meaning of high political trust in China, right? So for example, could reflect political hope, political faith, or Tian Jianshi, a political scientist, he suggests could be a reflection of cultural expectation, right? Chinese, the idea is that Chinese have very little expectation from the government. Therefore, no matter the performance, Chinese people have relatively high trust, right? But in Western democracies, political trust is tied to more to government performance, right? So poor performance or good performance could lead to trust. But even in the United States, for example, right, for decades, performance has not been at least bad all the time. But we see a decline, more than half-century decline of political trust in the United States, right? So more recent argument is about the transformation or the changing citizen expectation, right? Because citizens being more critical or citizens have a differential kind of changing their expectation. Therefore, their views, their trust in government reflect that kind of changing, right? And finally, we think about like the assumption, right? Chinese should have low trust. But when we think about, I also studied race and then political trust. So in the United States, we would often think like, or most people would assume, for example, racial minorities should have lower trust. For example, African Americans, Black Americans, they should have lower trust in government given the long history of, for example, slavery, continuing discrimination, right? But from the data shows that a lot of times racial minority have much, much higher trust than white Americans, right? Including Black Americans, sometimes they have more trust in government than white populations, right? So the idea is that maybe is the formation or the source of trust could come differently, right? So for some argument is about, for example, for racial minority trust is more about political hope, political faith, but for white Americans, political trust is more about performance, right? So when we think about Chinese, right, the Chinese, no matter regardless of the performance, Chinese, they have high trust in government, could come from cultural values or their political faith or their political hope, right? So the idea is not just simply dismiss China or regard China as a high outlier or this high trust is simply out of political fear. Instead, we should really seek ways to better understand the meaning of political trust in China. Thank you. Thank you.